On February 15, 1933, a 44-year-old housewife, Mrs. Johnson, received a reading that described a past life as Gracia, a woman of noble birth who lived during the time of Nero's persecution of the Christians. Born into the household of Pompey Theolus, Gracia was a frequent attendee at the arena, joining with those who watched the torture of the Christians. However, she did more than just watch. She became involved in Nero's propaganda efforts to discredit the Christian ideology. Or as Casey put it, in mental activity, she warred against these peoples. It was not enough to condemn them, there had to be an intellectual justification for the persecutions. Gracia was heavily involved in the smear campaign to bring the followers of Jesus into disrepute before silencing them forever. Nice lady. In her 20th century life, Mrs. Johnson found herself in a difficult marriage, almost estranged from her husband, when she received a series of readings for herself and those closest to her. Her physical readings addressed numerous medical ailments, including gastritis, sinus problems, pelvic disorders, and glandular dysfunction. She also asked about some psychological issues, including an inferiority complex and certain neurotic tendencies such as anxiety and nail biting. It is not clear to what extent these conditions were direct karma from her Roman experience, as we have seen in some of the other cases from the Nero period. However, it was a curious follow-up question in her life reading that we shall pursue in some detail, for it opens up new possibilities in the field of reincarnation studies. Amongst her queries about whether she had past life connections with her current family members, she inquired about her little dog, Mona, a small reddish terrier. Casey replied that she had indeed been associated with Mona during her Roman experience. When asked whether Mona was a dog then, Casey replied, "A lion." On the face of it, this might appear to be an example of Casey's wit and has been cited as an illustration of the use of humor in the readings. Had this been the only reading mentioning little Mona, it could be dismissed as a metaphysical joke. But apparently this woman was so attached to her pet, she continued to pursue the question in considerable detail in 4 other readings for relatives and friends. Let's set the stage and declare the characters in this mini-drama of the little dog that roared. In addition to the aristocratic Gracia, we find Pathosan, a Roman soldier and admirer of Gracia and her social class. Yet as he watched the persecutions, he came to despise the royalty and aristocrats who reveled in the cruelty. He developed a deep respect for the persecuted, eventually converting to Christianity and being killed in the arena by a lioness. You guessed it, little Mona. In his 20th century life, he was the husband of Mrs. Johnson. No wonder the marriage was in trouble. Mrs. Johnson also requested life readings for a nephew and niece, in which follow-up questions about Mona were addressed by Casey. Mrs. Johnson's niece had been in the same household as Gracia. She married the soldier Marcellus, who stood at the cross of Jesus. She found herself split in her allegiance. She chose to be helpful to both the Roman soldiers and gladiators who were assigned to the arena, and the persecuted Christians who were fed to the lions in that experience. She gained in spiritual development, but carried over into her present life a tendency to be moody at times and to have flights of fancy regarding religious matters, yet able to keep a balance with the material side of life. When asked about Mona, Casey replied that she did have a connection with Mona as the lioness in the arena, but details were not provided or requested. When asked about whether Mona will always be a dog, Casey said no, although such matters are dependent on the environment and surroundings into which the creature might incarnate. In a reading given for Mrs. Johnson's nephew, Casey said that he had been her son in Rome. As a young man, he was recruited as a Roman soldier, but converted to the teachings of Paul and was tortured for protecting Christians. A follow-up question in this lad's reading asked whether a life reading could be obtained for his aunt's little dog Mona. Casey replied, maybe, but it may not be understood unless you learn dog language. Yes, Casey did seem to be having a little fun on that one. The final character in this soul group who were together in Rome when little Mona roared was identified as Canopius, sister of Gracia, who in the 20th century was a friend and associate of Mrs. Johnson. As Canopius, a wealthy aristocrat, she consulted with royalty in making policies. Like her sister Gracia, she judged the Christians harshly. But rather than the intellectual and ideological differences that offended her sister, for Canopius it was strictly business. The disruptions caused by the Christian movement in Palestine, North Africa, and Greece were adversely affecting her wealth and prosperity. Profits were down, something had to be done, and it was in the arena. When this woman asked about her connections with Mona, Casey replied that she did not have any direct connections with the Roman lioness during that past life. The attraction that little Mona had for her was simply a matter of the high vibrations of each. Like attracts like. Thus we have completed our cast of characters, a soul group, not so unlike others that we have encountered on our reincarnational historical odyssey, and yet the addition of little Mona to the group does add a certain comic relief to an otherwise gruesome story. One can almost envision Gracia sitting in her booth at the arena, surrounded by the rich and noble, cheering on her favorite gladiator, the fierce lioness who ripped through the flesh of the despised Christians, the lioness that would reincarnate with her as her beloved little Mona, the dog that roared. But given Casey's strong Christian faith and the seriousness of the subject matter, could he joke about such things while in trance? Perhaps. You be the judge.